Welcome back to Revenge Codex. My name is Charlotte Miller. I'm 25 years old. And on a Tuesday morning in March, I stood in my kitchen in a bathrobe, watching my husband of 3 years read a piece of mail, and I watched the colour drain from his face like someone had pulled a plug. He didn't know I was watching. He thought I was upstairs, doing what he assumed I always did, existing quietly, waiting for direction, being whatever shape the room needed me to be. He was wrong. But let me take you back, because the ending only makes sense if you understand the beginning. And the beginning, like most things in my life, started with a version of me that everyone had already decided they understood. Before you go further, where are you watching this from right now? Because I want to know who needs to hear this story. If you've ever been the person in the room that everyone underestimates, the one who gets talked over, the one who smiles and says nothing while something inside them goes very, very quiet, stay with me. This one's for you. People who met me in my mid-20s made a lot of assumptions. I was soft-spoken. I dressed practically. I didn't volunteer opinions unless asked, and even then I kept them measured. I'd been told my whole life that I was too sensitive, too serious, too much in my own head, so I learned to move through rooms without making noise. I learned to listen more than I spoke. I learned that most people don't actually want your thoughts, they want your agreement. What they didn't understand was that I was listening. All the time. To everything. I had a degree in financial analysis that I'd earned on a partial scholarship, working weekend shifts at a hotel reception desk to cover what the scholarship didn't. I graduated in the top 8 of my class. I had a quiet, methodical mind that was genuinely good at spotting patterns, in numbers, in behavior, in the space between what people said and what they meant. Nobody who knew me as Daniel's wife knew any of that. To them, I was the quiet one. The one who made the snack platters at parties and laughed at the right moments and never made anyone uncomfortable. That was the version of me the world had agreed upon, and for a long time, I let them have it. Daniel encouraged that version. Not overtly. He was never what you'd call cruel, at least not in ways that left marks people could see. He was charming, socially gifted, professionally ambitious. He was the kind of man who walked into rooms and immediately located the most important person in them. He was good at people in the way that some people are good at chess, always calculating, always 3 moves ahead, but making it look effortless. He was also, I would come to understand, running a very careful game that required me to stay exactly where I was. We met when I was 21, at a mutual friend's birthday dinner. He was 29, established, funny in a way that felt like being let into a secret. He paid attention to me in a way I wasn't used to, asked real questions, remembered the answers. On our 3rd date, he told me I was the most interesting woman he'd met in years. I believed him. I was 21. I wanted to be believed. We moved fast. Within 8 months, I was living in his apartment. Within 18, we were married in a small ceremony at a vineyard 2 hours outside the city. My mother cried. His mother gave a toast about how Daniel had finally found someone steady. I smiled and held my champagne glass and told myself that steady was a compliment. I told myself that for a long time. The shift was gradual. It always is, I think. There's no single moment you can point to and say, there. That's where it started. It's more like weather. The temperature drops 1 degree at a time, and you don't notice you're cold until you're already shivering. The first thing I noticed was the way he spoke about my work. I had a job at a mid-sized accounting firm. Not glamorous, not aggressive, steady. Like me. I was good at it. I caught things other people missed, kept quiet about it in a way that built trust with my supervisors, and had been quietly accumulating a solid professional record. I enjoyed it. Daniel referred to it as Charlotte's little job, not in front of me, Usually. I overheard it once at dinner with his colleagues. The way you overhear something that was never meant to reach you. He said it lightly, with a small laugh, and the table laughed with him, and I sat there with a fork in my hand and felt something shift in my chest. I didn't say anything. I smiled. I changed the subject with a question about someone's renovation project and steered the evening somewhere else. But I remembered. That sentence mattered. His name was used like a door that opened rooms. We would arrive somewhere and he would be greeted first, warmly, and then someone would glance at me and say, "And this must be," and wait for him to fill in my name, which he always did, with an easy smile, as though introducing a pleasant piece of furniture he was particularly fond of. At his firm's events, I learned to move through crowds in a holding pattern. I wasn't expected to contribute, I was expected to present well, to be pleasant, to reflect adequately. I was decorative infrastructure. I told myself this was normal, that this was what partnership looked like in certain professional circles, that I was being supported in return for supporting him. And in the early years, there was support. He was proud of me in private moments, or something that looked like pride. He told me I was brilliant. He told me I saw things other people couldn't. He said it like a man describing a parlor trick, something charming, something contained. The second thing I noticed was the money. We had a joint account that our household expenses ran through. I contributed a fixed amount each month from my salary, and Daniel contributed the rest. He managed the account. He managed their investments. He managed everything financial with a brisk, efficient energy that made it seem like generosity. "I'm handling this so you don't have to," but which I slowly understood was control wearing the mask of competence. I didn't have visibility into our shared finances. Not real visibility. I could see the checking account. Yes. But their investment portfolio, the property documents, the insurance policies, those were in Daniel's name, in Daniel's files, accessed through Daniel's passwords. "You don't need to worry about all that," he said once, when I asked about a statement I'd found on the counter. "I've got it handled," he said it kindly. He said most things kindly. But I noticed. The third thing, and this one I sat with for a long time before I let myself name it, was that he had stopped seeing me as a person whose mind he respected. It wasn't aggressive. It was quieter than that. It was the way he would begin to answer a question directed at me before I had a chance to open my mouth. The way he would rephrase my opinions back to the room in slightly different words, as though translating me from a language they couldn't quite access. The way he would laugh gently when I pushed back on something and say, "Charlotte's always been a little intense about this stuff," in a tone that suggested I was a weather pattern to be waited out. I noticed the way his friends treated me. Warmly. On the surface. Superficially. They would ask about my work and not wait for the full answer. They would move through my sentences like rooms they were just passing through on the way, somewhere more interesting. And I noticed the way his mother spoke to me at family dinners, helpful, kind, slightly pitying, as though she had always assumed I was lucky to have Daniel and was grateful to be reminded of it. I didn't react to any of it. Not visibly. But something inside me was becoming very still. Not numb. Still. The way water goes still right before it reflects something clearly. It was a Sunday afternoon in October, about 2.5 years into our marriage, when the internal shift happened. Not dramatically. Not with tears or shouting. It was actually quite quiet. Daniel was on the phone with his brother, pacing the living room, and I was in the kitchen making coffee I didn't particularly want. I could hear pieces of the conversation, the casual rhythms of two people who had known each other their whole lives, laughing about something I wasn't part of. And then I heard my names. And then I heard Daniel say, in the offhand tone of someone describing the weather, "Charlotte doesn't really get involved in the financial stuff. She's not really built for it." I stood very still with my hand on the coffee press. He kept talking. The conversation moved on. He didn't know I'd heard. I stood there for a long moment. And then I finished making the coffee. And I sat down at the kitchen table. And I drank it slowly. And I thought. Not about anger. About clarity. Because what I understood, in that moment, with a precision that surprised me with its calmness, was that I had spent years allowing someone to define the edges of who I was. Not through force, through comfortable repetition. He had told a story about me, quietly, consistently, to everyone around us, and I had let it stand because confronting it had always seemed like more disruption than it was worth. I was not who he thought I was. And I was done letting the distance between those two things work in his favor. I stopped reacting that day. And I started observing. For those of you still with me, keep watching. Because what I did next is the part that changed everything. And it started, quietly, in a way that no one around me saw at all. The first thing I did was get informed. Really informed. I had a financial background that Daniel had always, in his easy, dismissive way, assumed was limited to spreadsheets and entry-level bookkeeping. He didn't know what I actually knew, because I had never given him reason to find out. That was the first real thing I understood about strategic silence. It's only useful if the other person doesn't know what's behind it. I spent the next several weeks doing something I hadn't done since graduate school. I studied. Not frantically, methodically. I went through everything I could access. I requested copies of our joint account statements. I reviewed every transaction. I looked at the documents I could access and began making a list of what I couldn't, and what that absence meant. I started working later at the office. Not dramatically, I just stopped leaving at 5 on the dot. I used the extra hours to speak, carefully, with a colleague who specialized in asset law. Nothing specific. General questions, framed as professional curiosity. I had always been known as someone thorough, so no one found it strange. I also, quietly, opened a personal account at a different bank. Not to hide money, nothing deceptive. Just my own account, in my own names, where I began to direct a portion of my salary that had previously gone straight into the joint account. The amount I redirected was small enough to be unremarkable, large enough to be, over time, meaningful. I want to be precise about something. I was not planning anything dramatic. I was not crafting revenge in the way you might imagine. What I was doing was something simpler and, I think, more powerful. I was preparing to be completely fine without him. That's different. That's not a trap you set. That's a door you build quietly, carefully, out of sight so that when the moment comes, you have somewhere to go. I also began to pay attention differently to the logistics of our shared life. Which utilities were in which name? What accounts existed that I wasn't on? What assets had been accumulated during our marriage and how they were titled? What his business interests looked like, because Daniel had, in the last 18 months, been increasingly involved in a side venture with 2 colleagues from his firm. Something he described to me in the vaguest possible terms, which I had previously accepted, and now found interesting. I didn't ask him about it directly. Instead, I listened. I am, if nothing else, an exceptional listener. I learned that the venture had recently secured a funding round. A meaningful one. The number Daniel mentioned casually in a phone call. On a Wednesday evening while I was sitting on the other side of a wall reading a document I was supposed to be done with, was not a small number. That mattered. I didn't react. I turned the page of my document and made a small note in a notebook I kept in my work bag. The strange thing about the preparation phase is how quiet it made me. I had expected to feel agitated, anxious, maybe, or propelled by anger in ways I'd have to work to contain. But what I actually felt was the opposite of agitation. I felt like someone who had found the floor after a long time of not knowing where it was. I slept well. I ate regularly. I went to work with a clarity I hadn't had in months. I was pleasant at home, attentive at dinners. The same version of myself Daniel had always seen, because that was useful, and because disruption at this stage would have served no one, least of all me. He noticed none of it, which told me something important. If the person you're building a life with can look at you every day and not perceive that something fundamental has shifted inside you, then they were never truly looking at you to begin with. That wasn't a painful realization. It was a useful one. In December, something happened that I hadn't planned for, but which I recognized immediately as significant. Daniel came home from a dinner with his business partners in an excellent mood, the kind of mood that had a particular quality to it, bright-edged and slightly too large for the room, which I had learned over the years meant that something had gone well that he was choosing not to immediately share. I observed this. I said nothing. 2 evenings later, I came home from the office to find him on the back porch on a phone call that ended the moment he heard the door. When he came inside, he was easy, casual, kissed me on the cheek and asked about my day. I told him about my day. And while I was talking, I watched his hands. He was still holding his phone. The screen was dark, but he had turned it face down on the counter, a small gesture. Casual. The kind a person makes without thinking. Remember that. I want to be careful here, because I know how this part of a story can sound. I'm not describing a woman who became paranoid, or who began to pull at threads indiscriminately. That is not what happened. What happened was simpler. I paid attention to the things that had always been in front of me, and I stopped deciding they were unimportant before I'd looked at them. In January, I had a quiet conversation with an attorney, someone a colleague had used 2 years earlier in a professional matter, not a domestic one, which meant there was no strange weight to the meeting. I asked general questions. I understood the landscape. I understood what marital assets meant in concrete terms. I understood timelines and documentation, and what a reasonable person would want to have in hand before a certain kind of conversation. I was a very reasonable person. By February, I had built the following, quietly and without incident, a complete financial picture of our shared life, including the assets Daniel had not thought to tell me about. A relationship with an attorney who was now formally, if discreetly, on retainer. A personal account with 3 months of my living expenses comfortably inside it. A clear understanding of Daniel's business venture and the valuation it had recently received, which meant I also had a clear understanding of what was relevant to any future legal conversation. And I had one more thing. A job offer. Not at my current firm, at a financial analysis consultancy 2 cities away that had approached me 4 months prior through a professional contact, had interviewed me twice remotely, and had extended an offer in late January that was, in salary terms, nearly double what I was currently making. I had said I needed time to consider. That was not entirely true. I had known what I was going to do almost immediately. But there were things I needed to have in place before I gave them my answer. By the first week of March, I had them. Now, let me tell you about the mail. There's a small credenza in our front hallway where we drop whatever comes through the front door. We had a shared understanding, not explicit, just absorbed, that Daniel sorted the mail. He'd done it since we moved in together, and it had simply continued, the way certain habits do, invisibly, until they feel like arrangements. But a few things I'd been waiting on were coming through the post rather than digitally. My attorney had advised this for certain documentation. Certain correspondences are better in physical form. They are, in the most practical sense, harder to unsee. On a Tuesday morning in March, I was upstairs when I heard the mail come through the slot. I heard Daniel cross the hallway. I heard the pause, the particular quality of silence that a person produces when they stop moving unexpectedly. I came halfway down the stairs. He was standing with his back to me, very still, holding several pieces of mail. I could see the return addresses on two of them from where I stood. One was from the attorney's office. One was from the bank where I held my personal account. Both were addressed to me. He turned slightly. He could see the attorney's return address clearly. The colour had left his face. He turned all the way and saw me standing on the stairs. There was a long moment. Neither of us spoke. He held up the envelope, not aggressively, more like a person holding something there not sure what to do with. "Charlotte. What is this?" I came down the rest of the stairs. I walked across the hallway and I took the envelope from his hand. "And the other ones?" And I said, calmly, "Those are mine, that's a law firm," he said. "Yes," I said. Another silence. Charlotte, his voice was different now. Still controlled. But the control was doing real work, you could hear the effort underneath it. "What's going on?" I looked at him for a moment. I thought about all the times I had looked at him across a room, and felt the particular loneliness of being someone's idea of a person, rather than the actual person. I thought about 3 years of quiet erosion, and the 10 months I'd spent, in private, making sure I was standing on ground that held. I said, "I think you already have a sense of what's going on, Daniel," and then I walked past him into the kitchen. I put the kettle on. I sat down at the table, the same table where, years earlier, I had drunk my coffee in the silence of my clarity, and I opened my own mail. He stood in the doorway. He said my name once more, quietly. I looked up. "I've retained an attorney," I said. "There will be a petition filed later this week. You'll receive documentation. My attorney can correspond with yours, or you can retain one now. Either way," I looked back down at the document in my hand. "There's tea if you want some. I'm going to stay in that room with you for a moment, because what happened in the next 60 seconds matters." He didn't shout. He didn't become threatening. Daniel, to his credit, had always been a man of surfaces, and even in that moment the surface held. What he did was something I hadn't fully anticipated, which was that he sat down, across the kitchen table from me. And he looked at me, really looked, the way he hadn't in years, and I watched something move through his face that was difficult to name. Not anger. Not grief. Quite. Something more like recognition. The particular expression of a person who has just understood something they should have understood much earlier. He said, quietly, "How long have you been planning this?" I thought about that. "I've been paying attention for a long time," I said. "I've been planning since October." He was quiet. "You heard me on the phone," he said. It wasn't a question. "Which call?" I asked. He looked at me. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt that he was genuinely uncertain. "Charlotte," he stopped. Started again. "I didn't think you were, I thought we were. I know what you thought," I said. And I said it without cruelty, because cruelty was never the point. "That's the thing, Daniel. You thought a lot of things about me that weren't accurate. And I let you. For a while. And then I stopped." He sat there across from me, in the kitchen of the home we'd shared for 3 years, and the version of events he'd been living inside, the version where I was a pleasant constant, manageable. Without depth he hadn't accounted for, that version dissolved. In its place was me. Just me. As I had always been. That wasn't even the hardest part for him. The hardest part came 3 days later. He had, by then, called an attorney of his own. He had presumably spent those 3 days reviewing what we each were entitled to, and what the financial picture of our marriage actually looked like in legal terms. He had also, I imagined, begun to understand the scope of what I knew, because my attorney was precise and thorough, and the petition was correspondingly detailed. He called me on a Thursday evening. I was at the office, running late legitimately. There was a report I was finishing, and his name came up on my phone. I let it ring. Then I texted, "My attorney can reach yours in the morning." There was a pause. Then, "Charlotte, there are things to discuss." I set my phone face down on my desk. I finished the report. What he wanted to discuss, I would learn through the appropriate channels, was the business venture, the funding round, the valuation he had not mentioned to me, which my attorney had included in the asset documentation, because marital assets are marital assets regardless of whose name they sit under during the marriage, regardless of who was told about them and who was kept casually, conveniently uninformed. That sentence mattered to him considerably. I want to tell you something about this part of the story, the legal part, because I know it's easy to frame these things as battles, wins and losses, scorekeeping. That's not how I experienced it. I experienced it as the natural conclusion of something I had set in motion with clarity rather than anger. I wasn't trying to punish Daniel. What I was doing was making sure that the version of our marriage that would be legally recognized, in its assets, its records, its official shape, was the accurate version. Not the version where I was someone who didn't understand financial things. Not the version where I was adjacent and decorative and nicely uninformed. The accurate version, where I had contributed, where I had been present, where the life we'd built together had a market value, and I was entitled to precisely half of it. That's not revenge. That's accounting. The mediation meeting was in early April. We sat across a table from each other in a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows, and Daniel looked like a man who had not been sleeping well, and I looked like what I was, someone who had. His attorney was polished, strategically aggressive, good at the particular art of making reasonable positions sound excessive. Mine was quieter, more precise, and better with numbers. I watched his attorney look at mine, and then look at me, and recalibrate. I've mentioned that I learned to move through rooms without making noise. That habit, it turned out, had a professional application as well, because I was not the woman they had prepared to meet. They had prepared to meet the woman Daniel had described, and Daniel's description of me, I imagined, had been shaped by the version of me he thought he knew. That version had certain assumed qualities. Softness, uncertainty, a vague financial naivety that could be gently redirected. The version that walked into that conference room had 10 months of preparation, a clear understanding of every asset in question, including 2 that Daniel's team had not foregrounded, and a stillness that the other side of the table found, I think, genuinely disconcerting. His attorney opened. Mine responded. We went through the numbers. At one point, Daniel looked at me directly across the table, and I held his gaze, and I thought about the Sunday afternoon in October when I'd stood in the kitchen with a hand on a coffee press and made the quiet decision that changed everything. I thought about how small that moment had looked from the outside, and how much it had contained. He looked away first. The settlement was reached in 2 sessions. It was fair. Mathematically, structurally fair, the kind of outcome that happens when documentation is thorough and the legal picture is accurate, and neither side can convincingly argue otherwise. I didn't celebrate. There was nothing to celebrate. Exactly. The marriage was over. 3 years of my life had a number attached to them now, and the number was honest. And that was something. But it wasn't the thing I had been building toward. The thing I had been building toward was simpler. In the 2nd week of April, I accepted the job offer at the consultancy. I contacted the hiring manager, a woman named Priya who I had spoken with 4 times and already found direct and clear-eyed, and I told her I was ready to discuss a start date. We agreed on the 1st of June. I found an apartment in the new city. Small, well-lit, near a park I had read about. I signed the lease on a Thursday afternoon, from my office, between two other appointments, and I sat for a moment after, looking at the signed document on my screen, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Not triumph. Not relief. Exactly. Something quieter. Space. The particular feeling of having space. The last time I saw Daniel was a Saturday in late April, when we went through the house to divide what was being divided. We had agreed, through our attorneys, on who took what. Most of it was straightforward. There were a few items that were sentimental rather than valuable, and those we navigated carefully, with the careful politeness of two people who have run out of the energy required to be unkind. At one point we were both in the living room, moving around each other, and he said, without preamble and in a voice that was stripped of its usual easy confidence, "I didn't know you were unhappy. I thought about that." "I wasn't always," I said. "When did it change?" "Gradually," I said. "The way most things do." He was quiet. He picked up a frame from the shelf, a small photograph from our first year, when we'd taken a weekend trip to the coast, looked at it, set it down. He said, "What did I do?" I looked at him. "You decided who I was," I said. "And then you stopped looking." He didn't have an answer for that. I hadn't expected one. I want to tell you what happened at my old firm in those final weeks, because that's a part of this story I haven't mentioned, and it belongs here. When I gave my notice, 4 weeks before my last day, proper and professional, my direct manager, a careful woman named Margaret who had watched my work for 3 years and said relatively little about it, asked me to come into her office. She closed the door. She told me that she had known for some time that I was underutilized at the firm. She told me that she had, on 2 occasions, considered putting my name forward for a senior analyst position that had come open, and had hesitated each time, and that sitting here now she wanted to say clearly that she regretted hesitating. I thanked her genuinely. I told her I understood why she'd hesitated, the professional context, the way I'd presented, the particular variety of invisibility I'd maintained. She looked at me shrewdly and said, "You weren't invisible, Charlotte. You just made yourself easy to overlook. There's a difference." I thought about that on the drive home. She was right. Invisible suggests absence. I was never absent. I was present. Acutely. The whole time. I just stopped broadcasting it. And then, when the moment was right, I let it be seen. There's something I haven't told you yet. Something that happened in the mediation that I've held back because it belongs at the end, not the middle. Toward the end of the second session, Daniel's attorney made a remark, carefully phrased, professionally hedged, suggesting that certain of my financial contributions to the marriage were limited given what he called the asymmetry of our earning trajectories. The implication being that I had benefited more than I had contributed, in purely financial terms, and that this should factor into the settlement math. My attorney let him finish. And then, quietly, she presented 3 things. The first was a detailed accounting of my financial contributions over the course of the marriage, including the amounts I had directed into household expenses, the market value of the domestic and administrative labor I had provided, which, itemized, was significant, and the documented impact of our arrangement on my own earning trajectory, given the degree to which I had adjusted my professional ambitions to accommodate Daniel's. The second was documentation of my incoming compensation at the consultancy. The number on that document made something shift in Daniel's attorney's expression. Nothing dramatic, a small recalibration, the kind a person makes when they realize the terrain is different than they thought. The third was a valuation summary for the business venture, the full one, with the current numbers, not the numbers Daniel had been quietly keeping to himself. There was a pause that lasted longer than pauses usually do in those rooms. And then we continued. "My name is Charlotte Miller. I am 25 years old. I am writing this from my apartment in a city I chose. The park I read about is real, and it is exactly what I imagined. I run there in the mornings before work. And I think while I run. And the things I think about have changed. I used to think about what I wasn't. What I wasn't being given space to become. What I was being quietly prevented from being by a life arranged around someone else's idea of me. Now I think about what I'm building. And the building feels different when you're the architect. The job is hard in the ways that good work is hard. Priya turned out to be exactly as direct as she seemed. I like the team. I am, for the first time in years, in rooms where people wait for me to finish my sentences. Where the thing I say next is something they are genuinely curious about. Where my name is said first. It took some getting used to. I'm going to tell you one more thing before I finish. About 6 weeks after the settlement, I was at a professional event, the kind of industry gathering I used to attend as someone's wife, and now attended as someone with a name badge of my own, and a reason to be there that had nothing to do with anyone else. I was standing at the edge of the room with a drink, listening to a conversation between two people I'd just met, when someone across the room waved at me. It took me a moment to place them, a colleague of Daniel's, someone I'd sat across from at dinner parties, someone who had always spoken to me with the particular friendly vagueness of a person who has not registered you as significant. He crossed the room. He said my name correctly, both names with what looked like genuine warmth. He said he'd heard I'd moved cities, heard I was at the consultancy, heard some good things about my work there. He said, I didn't know you were in financial analysis. I looked at him pleasantly. You never asked, I said. He laughed, a little uncertainly. Fair enough, and then I excused myself, because there was someone across the room I actually wanted to speak to. I've thought a lot about what the lesson of this story is. Whether there is one, or whether the search for a lesson is itself the wrong instinct, a way of tidying up something that was, in reality, just a life being lived and a person slowly becoming more themselves. But I think there is something worth naming. The version of power that changed my circumstances wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. It didn't perform. It was built in quiet rooms and late evenings and careful months of becoming genuinely prepared for the life I wanted, so that when the moment came, I didn't have to fight for it. I just had to walk through the door I'd built. There are people watching this right now who are in the middle of something they haven't named yet. A slow dimming. A life that has quietly arranged itself around someone else's comfort. A version of you that you've allowed to become the official version, because confronting the gap seemed like too much work. I want to say to you what no one said to me. The gap is not as large as it feels. And the ground you're standing on, if you are careful and honest and patient with yourself, is already more solid than you think. You don't need to explode. You don't need to perform. You don't need them to understand. You just need to know who you are, in the privacy of your own mind, with perfect clarity. And then quietly, methodically, without announcement, you build. My name is Charlotte Miller. I'm 25. And the most powerful thing I ever did was stay completely still, in a kitchen on an October afternoon, and decide to start paying attention. Everything else followed.